The rescue. The planet was not kind to anyone who walked its surface, and every step across its jagged ground told the story of a place that wanted nothing more than to drive away life. Yet one human walked there, determined and steady. His name was Daniel, a man who had been sent to map the edges of uncharted space and learn what resources this harsh world might hold. The air was heavy with strange scents, the sky painted with two suns that cast long shadows, and the nights echoed with cries of unseen creatures. But Daniel had grown used to the silence and the danger. His small camp stood alone against the wilderness. One evening, while he scouted beyond the ridges, he heard a sound that froze him in place. It was not the call of a beast, nor the rumble of shifting rocks. It was softer, weaker, a cry for help that barely broke through the thick air. Daniel followed it with caution, his hand close to the weapon at his side, and after moving through a tangle of sharp plants, he saw her. She was small, her skin a pale shade of blue, her body trembling as she lay against a fallen tree. Her eyes glowed faintly. Even in the dusk, she was no human. He had never seen her kind before. Instinct told him to turn away. Human law warned explorers not to meddle with unknown species. It was safer to leave them alone and report later. But his heart told him something else. He saw how weak she was. He saw the blood that stained her arm. He saw the fear in her glowing eyes. And he could not walk away. Daniel knelt beside her, speaking gently. Though he knew she might not understand his words, he reached for the medkit at his side. She flinched at his movement but did not resist when he cleaned the wound and wrapped it with care. The girl made a sound almost like a word, her lips forming syllables he did not know. She looked at him as though asking why he was helping her. Daniel only shook his head and smiled, saying quietly, "Because you need me," though she could not understand the meaning. The tone seemed enough. Her breathing steadied little by little until exhaustion claimed her and she fainted in his arms. Daniel lifted her easily, though she was taller than he first thought, and carried her back to his camp. He laid her inside the shelter, covering her with a thermal blanket, and checked the wound again. Night fell and strange creatures prowled the edges of the camp, but Daniel kept the fire burning bright. He sat awake, his rifle ready, his eyes shifting from the dark wilderness to the fragile figure sleeping inside. Every instinct of survival told him this was a risk. If her people came looking, they might not thank him for his help. They might see him as an enemy. But something deeper inside told him this was the right thing to do. He had been alone for so long, and now fate had given him someone to protect. Morning brought thin light, and with it the girl stirred. She opened her eyes, slowly, confusion passing across her face when she saw him sitting nearby. Daniel greeted her softly, offering water from his canteen. She hesitated, then reached out her hand, shaking but determined. She drank greedily, her lips trembling with every sip. Then she whispered something in her language, the sound foreign yet gentle. Daniel only nodded, hoping his kindness was clear even if his words were not. Over the next hours she tried to rise, but her strength failed and he urged her to rest. He gave her small pieces of food from his rations. She ate carefully, watching him with eyes that no longer carried only fear but also curiosity at times. She touched the bandages as if surprised that he had healed her. Daniel asked her name again and again in his own tongue, until finally she seemed to understand. She pressed her hand to her chest and spoke one clear word. It was soft like the breeze but carried weight. Her name, though strange to him, became etched in his memory. Daniel knew nothing of her people or why she was alone in the wilderness, but one truth had already formed. In his mind he had crossed the line between duty and compassion, and there was no turning back. He did not know that far beyond the ridges, eyes were already watching him, eyes that belonged to others of her kind, who would soon come seeking her, and when they did, the galaxy itself would begin to shift. The recovery. The morning stretched long on the strange planet, and Daniel moved about his camp with quiet purpose while the alien girl lay under the blanket. Her breathing slow but steady, he felt a small sense of relief that she was still alive, because when he had first found her, he had not been sure she would make it. The wound on her arm was deep, though his field training had taught him enough to clean and close it. Still, he knew that medicine was only half the battle. The other half was her own strength and her will to survive. Daniel checked the perimeter of the camp, scanning the ridges for movement. The wilderness was alive with strange noises that shifted from guttural roars to high-pitched calls, but his ears had learned to tell which were near and which were distant. Today they seemed far off, and he thanked fortune for that. When he returned to the shelter, he saw her eyes open wide and alert. Now she seemed to study every corner of his camp, her glowing eyes reflecting the firelight even in daylight. He crouched near her, offering a piece of dried ration. She looked at it suspiciously at first, then slowly reached out and took it between her delicate fingers. Her lips pressed against it, and she tasted it cautiously. A moment later, she ate with more confidence. Daniel smiled, faintly glad that hunger had won over doubt. He spoke softly, though his words meant little to her, pointing at the food, then at himself, then at her. He repeated the word, "Eat," again and again, until she seemed to understand. Her eyes softened slightly, and she whispered something that sounded almost like thanks in her own tongue. As the hours passed, she began to gesture, pointing at the sky, then at the horizon, her voice rising in a tone that carried both sorrow and warning. Daniel listened carefully, though he understood little still. He picked up fragments, the way she held her hand over her chest, and then mimed many figures together, told him of her people scattered, perhaps hunted. Her voice trembled when she described them. Daniel felt a cold unease. He had suspected something like this, but to hear the hints of it from her made the danger more real. He told her his name slowly, clearly pointing to himself and repeating it, "Daniel." She tilted her head, listening, and then tried to repeat the sound. Her accent bent the word into something softer, but he could hear the effort, and it warmed him. She touched her chest again, and spoke her name, this time more firmly than the night before. It was long, filled with tones that rose and fell like music. Daniel tried to repeat it clumsily, earning a small laugh from her. The sound surprised him, and for the first time since arriving on this harsh world, he felt the weight of loneliness lift, if only for a moment. The next day, her strength grew little by little. She managed to stand, though Daniel stayed close, ready to catch her. She staggered across the shelter, her bare feet unsteady on the ground, yet her pride kept her moving. She pointed often toward the ridges, her expression serious, as if urging him to leave this place. But Daniel shook his head. He could not abandon her, not when she could barely walk. She seemed frustrated, yet touched by his resolve. In the evenings, when the wilderness grew louder, she stayed close to the fire, her glowing eyes staring into the flames. Sometimes she spoke in long streams of words, her hands moving to shape meaning. Daniel caught pieces of it, or thought he did. He believed she spoke of her tribe of hunters who once roamed these valleys, but who now had been driven away by something darker. Her tone was full of sorrow when she described it, her head lowering as if in shame or grief. Daniel longed to ask more, but language stood between them like a wall. Still, their bond grew in the small acts of kindness, the sharing of food, the careful changing of bandages, the way she tried to mimic his words, and the way he studied hers. He began to feel the weight of something larger pressing in on them like a storm waiting beyond the horizon. She was not alone in this world, and if she had a tribe, as she hinted, then they might already know where she had gone and who had found her one. Night. As the second moon rose silver across the sky, Daniel felt eyes upon the camp. He scanned the shadows, his rifle in hand, but saw nothing, only silence heavier than usual. He returned to the fire, but could not shake the feeling. The girl seemed restless too. Her gaze flicking often toward the dark ridges, she whispered words that carried fear. Her hands tightening on the blanket, Daniel understood only this much: their peace would not last. Someone was coming, and soon, the first encounter. Night carried a weight Daniel had not felt before. Every flicker of the fire seemed to stretch shadows longer, and every breath of wind felt like the whisper of something unseen. He sat close to the fire, his rifle resting across his lap, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the camp. The alien girl, whom he now called by her soft melodic name, sat curled near the flames, her glowing eyes reflecting worry. She had grown stronger each day, but tonight her body was tense, as though she sensed something far beyond his understanding. Hours passed in uneasy silence. Then the stillness broke. Daniel heard movement, faint at first, then clearer, the crunch of gravel under cautious steps he raised. his weapon slowly scanning the ridges. A faint shimmer of figures appeared at the edge of the clearing. They moved like shadows, long and tall, their forms half hidden by the strange trees. Daniel stood carefully, the fire casting his silhouette wide. Across the camp he could see them now, their shapes not beast but humanoid. Their faces glowing faintly like the girl's, though their postures were stiff with suspicion. The girl rose unsteady but determined. She moved before Daniel, raising her hands, in a gesture that seemed both warning and welcome. Her voice rose in her own tongue, strong and urgent. The words carried across the clearing like a call. Daniel could not understand the meaning, but he saw the effect. The shadows paused, then slowly stepped forward until the firelight revealed them more clearly. There were 5 of them, all women, their bodies marked with signs of survival, their clothes torn but functional, their eyes glowing with the same strange light as the girl's. They looked from her to Daniel, their faces guarded. Daniel lowered his weapon, though he kept it close. He could feel the tension like a rope pulled tight. The girl turned to him, speaking his name softly as though to assure the others that he was no threat then. She spoke again in long streams of her language, her gestures sharp and deliberate. She pointed at her arm, showing the bandage. She pointed at Daniel, then at herself, then at the camp. The women exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from suspicion to something closer to cautious belief. One of the women stepped forward, taller than the rest, her posture strong like a leader. She spoke slowly to the girl, who answered quickly, her words tumbling with urgency. Daniel watched the exchange, unable to follow, but he understood the emotions. The leader's eyes softened slightly, then narrowed again as they flicked toward him. She circled him like a predator, measuring him, her gaze lingering on his weapon and the supplies he had carried from Earth. Finally, she stopped and spoke one word, short and sharp. Daniel could not guess its meaning, but the girl looked at him with pleading eyes, as if urging him to stay calm. The women moved into the camp with slow, deliberate steps, their eyes never leaving Daniel. The girl touched his arm lightly, whispering something that carried reassurance. He nodded, trusting her, though unease still burned inside him. The women gathered near the fire, their voices blending in hushed tones, their eyes flashing with sorrow and anger. Daniel realized then that they had not come for him at all. They had come for her. They had been searching, desperate to find their lost sister or daughter or friend. And now here she was alive, because a stranger had chosen to help her. As the night deepened, the tension eased little by little. The women sat close to the flames, sharing food that Daniel offered, though they took it with hesitation. They spoke among themselves, often looking at him as though trying to decide his worth. One even touched the edge of his jacket with curiosity, feeling the strange material between her fingers. Daniel remained quiet, letting them see that he meant no harm. He could not tell if they accepted him, but at least they had not attacked, and that was enough for now. When the fire burned low and the moon shifted higher, the leader of the women finally spoke to Daniel. Her words unfamiliar, but her tone clear. It was both a challenge and a question. The girl quickly translated in her own broken way, pointing toward the horizon. And then at him the meaning formed in his mind. They wanted to know why he had saved her, and what he intended to do next. Daniel answered not with words, but with action. He placed his rifle down by the core, fire showing empty hands. Then he pressed his palm gently over his chest and bowed his head. The leader studied him long moments, then gave a slight nod. It was not acceptance, but it was not rejection either. Daniel understood that trust would not come easily, but tonight a first step had been taken. The women had come out of the shadows into his camp, and their eyes, though wary, no longer burned with hostility. He looked at the girl, who now seemed stronger than ever, her faint smile telling him that his choice on that first night had not only saved her, but had begun something much larger than either of them could yet see. The tribe's plea. The sun rose slowly over the jagged ridges, painting the sky with red and gold, and Daniel woke to find the women still gathered around the fading fire, their glowing eyes alert and watchful even in the early light. The alien girl he had saved now sat among them, her head high, her wound healing, and her spirit stronger than before. Daniel stretched his tired body and stepped out of the shelter. The leader of the women fixed her gaze upon him, her posture sharp with authority. She spoke in her language, commanding the others to fall silent. Daniel could not understand her words, but he felt the weight of her voice. The girl rose and moved to stand between them, her voice softer but filled with urgency as she tried to translate. Broken pieces of meaning reached him. She spoke of a tribe, her people scattered across the valleys, hunted by enemies. She spoke of loss of families torn apart. She gestured to the women around her, who nodded solemnly, then to the ridges beyond, where danger waited. Daniel pieced together the fragments, realizing that these women had not only been searching for her, but were themselves survivors clinging to hope in a world that sought to crush them. The leader took a step closer, her hand pointing toward Daniel, then toward the wilderness, then back to the group, her tone rising and falling with passion. Daniel could not grasp the words, but the girl's eyes revealed their intent. They were asking for his help. They had seen what he had done for one of their own, and now they wanted more than kindness. They wanted protection. They wanted him to stand with them against the threats that hunted them. Daniel felt the air grow heavy with the enormity of what they were asking. He was one man alone, far from human command and supplies, yet they looked at him as if he could be the wall between them and destruction. The camp fell into silence as the women waited for his answer. Daniel ran his hands through his hair, feeling the weight pressing on his shoulders. He thought of the mission that had sent him here, a mission of mapping resources and reporting back, not of saving tribes or fighting wars. But as he looked into their eyes, he saw no malice, no trickery, only desperation and hope. It stirred something deep inside him, the part of humanity that refused to abandon those who needed help, the part that had driven him to save the girl in the first place. He knelt slowly, lowering himself to their level, and spoke in his own tongue, knowing they would not understand, yet hoping his voice carried truth. "I will help you," he said, his hand pressed to his chest, his eyes steady on the leader. She tilted her head, listening to the tone more than the words, and then, after a long pause, she gave a slow nod. It was not full trust, but it was a beginning. The women murmured among themselves, some showing relief, others still wary, but the first bridge had been built. The girl touched his arm lightly, gratitude shining in her eyes, and for the first time since she had come to him, she smiled without fear. Daniel felt warmth stir in his chest, though the world around them was cruel and dangerous. This moment carried a spark of something greater. He realized then that he was no longer just a lone human explorer. He was now tied to their fate, whether he wished it or not. The women began to move with purpose, gathering, their few belongings speaking in urgent tones. The leader pointed to the horizon, where smoke rose faintly in the distance. Daniel followed her gaze, his stomach tightening. Whoever had done this to them was not far. Their enemies were moving closer. Each passing day, and the tribe knew they had little time left. Daniel checked his rifle, cleaned the barrel, and counted the ammunition. Every bullet would matter in the days to come as the sun climbed higher. The small camp began to transform. The alien women worked quickly, building makeshift packs, preparing to travel. The girl who had first entered his life now stood stronger. Though her arm still bore the mark of her wound, she stayed near Daniel, guiding him with gestures, explaining small things about the land, pointing out safe plants to eat or dangers to avoid. He realized she was not only surviving but teaching him, showing that trust went both ways. By nightfall, the decision was clear. They could not stay. The camp was too exposed, and the enemy too near. The leader signaled that they would move deeper into the valleys toward hidden caves, where more of their people might still be holding on. Daniel shouldered his pack, tightened his weapon, and looked once more at the fire he had built in solitude for weeks now. It was no longer just his fire. It was the center of something larger, a bond between human and alien that was only beginning to grow. When the group set out under the silver light of the moons, Daniel walked. At the front, his senses sharp, every shadow holding danger, yet behind him, he could hear the quiet steps of the women. And he knew they trusted him. Even if only a little, that trust weighed heavy, but also gave him strength. The girl walked at his side, her eyes glowing with resolve, and in that moment Daniel understood the truth. His life was no longer his own. It belonged to this fragile alliance, and the path ahead would change everything for them all. The human decision. The journey into the valleys was harsh and slow. The ground was uneven with jagged stones cutting at their feet, and the air was heavy with dust and heat. Yet the small group pressed on with quiet determination. Daniel walked at the front, scanning every ridge and shadow, his rifle ready, while the alien women followed behind, silent, but alert. They moved with the grace of those who had lived their lives in this dangerous land, every sense sharpened for survival. The girl walked close to him, her arms still wrapped in bandages, but her strength returning with each passing day. The deeper they went, the more signs of struggle appeared: broken branches, burned patches of ground, shattered stones scattered as if from recent battles. The women moved faster whenever they saw such marks, their voices hushed and tense. Daniel began to understand without needing translation. This land was not just cruel by nature, it was scarred by conflict. The enemy they feared had been here and might return at any moment. One evening, when they found shelter among tall rocks, the leader finally sat before Daniel, her glowing eyes fixed on him. She spoke for a long time, her voice carrying both strength and sorrow. The girl listened and then did her best to translate her words. She told him that their tribe had once been many, spread across valleys and ridges they had lived in, peace hunting and raising families, but then another force had come, dark and ruthless. They did not speak her language, but their violence was clear. They hunted. The women drove them from their homes and scattered them across the land. Daniel listened in silence, his chest heavy as the story unfolded. He could see the pain in their faces as they remembered what had been lost. The leader spoke again, her voice sharp with anger and resolve, and the girl translated. Carefully, they wanted him to fight with them. They had seen his weapon, seen the way he carried himself, seen the courage he showed when he saved one of their own. To them, he was not only a stranger, he was a warrior from beyond the stars, someone who could tip the balance against their hunters. Daniel sat back, staring at the fire. He felt the weight of their words pressing down on him. He thought of Earth far away, of his orders to map and report, to stay neutral in local conflicts, to avoid drawing humanity into unnecessary wars. But then he looked at the girl sitting quietly by his side, her glowing eyes fixed on him with both hope and fear. She was alive because he had chosen to defy orders, because he had chosen to listen to his heart rather than cold rules. And now that choice stood before him again, magnified 100 times. The women waited for his answer, their bodies tense, their voices hushed. Daniel took a long breath and thought of what it meant to be human. Humanity had always been defined not only by survival, but by the refusal to abandon others in need. Compassion and courage had built their history, and though the galaxy might call them reckless or dangerous, Daniel knew that this was what made them who they were. He stood slowly, his shadow cast long by the fire. He placed his rifle across his chest, his hand resting on it, and then pressed his other hand to his heart. He spoke firmly, though they would not understand the words. "I will stand with you." His voice carried the tone of decision, unshakable. The girl caught the meaning before the translation even came. She cried out with relief, her hand gripping his arm. The leader studied him. Long moments, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. Her head. The others murmured among themselves, some skeptical, others hopeful. But Daniel knew the choice had been made. He would fight alongside them no matter what came. That night the camp felt different, the air still heavy with danger, yet filled with a new sense of resolve. The women shared their knowledge of the valleys, teaching Daniel signs of the enemy trails, ways to move unseen, places where ambushes might be set. They showed him their crude weapons, sharp stones and spears, and he began to think of how human knowledge and alien skill could join together. He planned quietly, sharpening his mind for the battle he knew was coming. The girl sat beside him near the fire, her voice soft as she spoke words he could not understand, but he caught the meaning in her eyes, gratitude and trust unshaken by fear. He realized then that his life was no longer a lone mission. He was bound to them by choice and by duty, not to his commanders, but to his own heart, and to the bond that had grown between species. Daniel stared into the fire and whispered to himself, humanity would not walk away. Not this time, not ever. The first clash, the sun rose harsh and red over the valley, casting long shadows across the jagged rocks. Daniel moved silently, with the girl and the women trailing behind him, their eyes sharp, their senses tuned to every sound the wind carried whispers of movement. The ground trembled faintly beneath their feet, but it was not from the earth. It was from anticipation, fear, and determination coiled together like a living thing. Daniel checked his rifle, adjusting the sights, while the girl scanned the ridges above, pointing out small movements in the distance, shapes moving with purpose. The leader signaled them to halt. Crouching behind a rock, she gestured toward a narrow pass that led deeper into the valley. And Daniel understood immediately that this was an ambush. They were to draw the enemy into a trap, a small group versus a larger, but less organized force. The human's instinct to analyze and strategize merged with the women's instinct to move unseen and to strike without warning. They whispered in their language. Daniel tried to memorize gestures and signals, knowing that every second counted. The enemy came slowly, at first shadows in the distance, then more clearly shapes with weapons glinting in the sunlight. They moved in ranks, but there was chaos in their formation. Not a disciplined army, just hunters who believed themselves unstoppable. The women tensed as they recognized patterns in their approach. Daniel's heart pounded, but his mind was clear. He was not here for diplomacy. He was here for survival, and to stand with those who had trusted him. The girl moved to his side, pointing toward a cluster of rocks ideal for cover, and Daniel nodded quickly, signaling the women to spread into position. They moved with silence and precision, their footsteps like whispers, their eyes like predators, watching prey. The enemy came closer, unaware that they were walking straight into a plan they had underestimated. Daniel's presence underestimated the courage of the women who had waited for this moment for days. They did not know that humanity could strike with method and with fire that crossed the stars. Daniel took the first shot, careful and precise, a single blast that took down the closest hunter. The women moved instantly, taking advantage of the chaos, arrows and spears striking from hidden positions. The enemy stumbled, trying to understand what was happening. Their confidence shattered. They had expected fear and terror from those they considered weak. Instead, they met deadly force, guided by cunning and determination. The girl watched wide-eyed as Daniel moved, from cover to cover, firing with accuracy. Teaching by instinct, the women followed his lead, striking where he could not reach. The battle raged for what felt like hours, the valley echoing with the clash of bodies and the cry of pain. The women moved with unmatched speed and agility. Daniel adapted his strategies, constantly predicting movements, anticipating attacks, learning the land as if he had been born into it. The enemy's numbers were greater, but coordination was weak, and each time they regrouped, they found themselves faced with death instead of easy victory. The girl ran to rescue a wounded woman, dragging her behind a rock. Daniel provided cover fire, ensuring no one approached them from behind. As the sun climbed higher, the last of the enemy forces fled, retreating down the slopes, broken, confused, their arrogance destroyed. The women cheered softly but not loudly, careful not to alert any others hiding nearby. Daniel looked at them all, his chest heaving from exertion, but his mind calm and focused. He realized that this small victory had changed something. The women no longer saw him as just a stranger. They saw him as a partner, someone who could walk into fire and not flinch, someone who could be trusted with life and death decisions. The girl hugged him tightly, her gratitude unspoken but clear. The leader approached, finally nodding with approval. She gestured toward Daniel in a way that declared him part of them, not as an outsider, but as one of their own. Their trust placed a weight on his shoulders heavier than any weapon, heavier than any battle he had faced before. Yet it was a weight he accepted willingly. He looked toward the horizon, knowing that the enemy would regroup, that more danger lay ahead, but the bond they had formed in the heat of the first clash could not be broken together. They would face whatever came with courage, strategy, and humanity's unshakable will. Daniel felt a strange pride swelling within him, a mixture of relief and determination. The girl smiled up at him, her eyes shining with trust and hope. He knew then that this was the beginning of something larger than any single fight, that humanity could not simply survive, but could inspire. Others could unite disparate beings against cruelty and oppression, that every choice to act with courage had ripples far beyond the immediate battle. The valley seemed quieter now, the dust settling over broken rocks and scattered weapons, yet in the silence there was energy, anticipation, and the promise of more challenges ahead, the arrival of the tribe. The sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Daniel stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, the wind whipping through his hair, carrying the scent of dust and smoke from the previous battle. He felt the girl's hand slip into his, and he looked down to see her eyes wide with anticipation. They had survived the ambush, but the feeling of unease lingered. In the air, a premonition of something greater, something waiting beyond the next hill. The women gathered around him, silent but alert, their movements precise and coordinated, a living shield ready for anything. The leader approached Daniel. Her eyes, sharp and respectful, she gestured toward the far end of the valley, signaling that more were coming. Through the deepening shadows, shapes emerged, at first distant, then unmistakable, a group of women, larger and more formidable than any Daniel had ever seen, their skin patterned with colors that blended with the landscape, their eyes glowing faintly in the dying light. The girl's grip tightened as she whispered in her language. The leader nodded, acknowledging the newcomer tribe. Daniel felt the tension rise around him. The women beside him shifted into defensive positions. Yet there was no fear in their movements, only readiness and silent communication that spoke louder than words. The approaching tribe moved with purpose, each step deliberate, each glance calculated, like hunters not seeking confrontation, but seeking recognition. As they drew nearer, Daniel stepped forward, his rifle lowered but held ready. The girl at his side whispered something, and he understood she was introducing him to them, a human who had shown courage, who had risked his life for one of their own. The leader of the newcomers halted at a respectful distance, her eyes scanning him from head to toe, assessing strength, resolve, and heart. Daniel held her gaze, steady, showing nothing but calm confidence. The smaller tribe behind him mirrored his stance, showing that they too would stand united in acceptance or in defense of what they had built together. The leader spoke, then words flowing in her language, unfamiliar to Daniel, but the girl translated quickly. They had come because they had heard of what he had done. The enemy forces scattered and broken, the courage of one human had inspired stories carried on the wind, faster than any weapon, faster than any fleet. They came not to fight but to join and to learn to fight alongside them. Daniel felt a surge of pride and disbelief. A human stranger in a strange world had earned respect, not by domination, but by action, guided by morality and courage. He realized then that the galaxy underestimated humanity in ways they could not even imagine. The girl smiled wide, holding his hand tighter, showing the bond between worlds that had begun to form. The tribes approached closer, forming a circle around Daniel. The leaders of each smaller group nodding toward him, silently acknowledging his deeds, his decisions, his willingness to act without hesitation and without thought for reward. They placed their trust in him and in the unity he represented. The girl ran forward and embraced the newcomers, greeting them as family and allies. Daniel watched as bonds formed and ideas shared in gestures and words, a language beyond simple communication, a language of trust and mutual respect. The sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, casting the valley into twilight. The moment felt sacred, a promise of protection and alliance that had been forged in the fires of battle and courage. Daniel addressed the women and the girl, his voice calm and commanding. Yet gentle, he spoke of unity, of strength, of honor, of standing for what is right. No matter the odds, they listened intently, learning his gestures, his cadence, his method of leadership without words that could be misunderstood. He showed them strategy and coordination. He taught patience and timing. He shared knowledge of weapons of survival and of foresight in the face of danger. The girl translated every lesson with care, ensuring no meaning was lost, as they absorbed each detail like sponges, ready to become forces themselves. Night fell fully over the valley, but the energy did not fade. The tribes gathered around fires, sharing stories of bravery, recounting the ambush, and how Daniel had led them with clarity and precision. The stars above seemed brighter somehow, reflecting the bonds now formed below. Daniel felt a quiet determination settle within him. He knew this was only the beginning, that greater threats would come, that the galaxy would test them again and again. But he also knew that together they were unstoppable, that the courage of one human could ignite the bravery of many others across worlds and species. He looked at the girl, at the leaders of the tribes, at the women who had trusted him, and he smiled, knowing that humanity had once again proven itself not through intimidation but through action, guided by conscience and unyielding will. The girl whispered softly, leaning against him, "We are ready." He nodded his hand, brushing her hair back, feeling the weight of responsibility and the thrill of purpose coursing through him together. They looked to the horizon, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges, but that together they would meet them head-on, united, fearless, and unstoppable. Their story would become legend among the stars, and humanity's name would carry across galaxies as beings who acted with courage and heart, and who could turn the tide of any battle, not with numbers but with will. The wind carried whispers of the mountains across the valley. Daniel stood at the edge, looking at the tribes gathered below their forms, glowing in the soft light of the twin moons. The girl at his side held his hand tightly, her eyes reflecting the firelight and something more, something unspoken, that bound their fates together. The women from both tribes moved with quiet grace around him, their presence both protective and reverent. They had come not as conquerors, but as allies drawn by courage and by the choices of a human who refused to turn away when others would have fled. The air was thick with anticipation and respect. The ground seemed to hum beneath their feet, as if the planet itself recognized the gravity of the moment. Daniel breathed deeply, feeling the weight of what had transpired and the promise of what was yet to come. He looked to the horizon where distant stars shimmered with possibilities. The girl whispered softly, telling him the stories that had traveled ahead of him, how his actions had reached ears and hearts across lands he had never seen, how a single decision had sparked hope and allegiance. The tribes listened and learned from him, not because they were commanded, but because they trusted his judgment, his heart, and his vision. They mirrored, his movements imitating his gestures, absorbing his knowledge, becoming stronger and more coordinated. With every passing second, the sun rose behind the mountains, sending beams that danced across the valley, painting the warriors in light and shadow, each figure a testament to unity, courage, and the unstoppable spirit of humanity. The leaders of the tribe stepped forward, bowing slightly in acknowledgement, their eyes filled with determination and respect. Daniel stepped toward them, offering gestures of peace and strategy. He showed them the ways to protect their lands, to protect their people, to prepare for any threat. The girl translated each word carefully, ensuring the meaning resonated in every heart. The women nodded their faces, showing resolve that transcended fear, that embraced purpose, that accepted guidance without surrendering autonomy. It was a meeting of minds and hearts, a convergence that could shape worlds as the day progressed. The valley came alive with training and planning. The tribes moving in patterns, Daniel demonstrated their coordination, perfecting timing, reading each other's intent. Before it happened, the girl laughed softly beside him, watching as alliances formed and as humans and aliens learned from each other. The lessons were more than tactics. They were lessons in trust and courage and resilience that no weapon alone could teach. And Daniel felt pride swelling within him, not for himself but for what humanity could inspire when it chose to act without hesitation, to protect and to uplift the weak. The valley echoed with their chants and coordination, their movements a dance of precision that told any who watched that this force was not to be underestimated. Night returned, bringing stars in multitudes. Daniel and the girl sat at the highest ridge, watching the fires below, reflecting on what had been accomplished and what was to come. He spoke softly to her, words filled with promise and determination, knowing that together they had forged bonds that would outlast wars and enemies, and that the legacy of a human who had dared to act would ripple across the galaxy, inspiring courage and respect in countless hearts. They sat in silence, listening to the whispers of the night, feeling the pulse of life around them, knowing that the future was theirs to shape and that no force could diminish the spirit that had united worlds around the courage of one human. The girl leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Your name will be remembered." Across the stars, Daniel smiled, feeling a warmth that surpassed victory and power, a connection deeper than any battle could forge together. They rose, looking over the valley at the tribe, standing proud at the edge of destiny, ready to face whatever. Would come their story, a beacon of courage and hope for all who would follow the end.